Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English, and we now are going to turn to Mark Twain's classic text, The Invalid's Story. I'm with you on page 360, 361. However, I just want to back up for a second to page 346, 347. So look there quickly with me for just a moment. And be reminded that your textbook company pairs together The Invalid Story with Blues Ain't No Mockingbird, a text that we have already discussed. At the Literary Analysis 2B, and I hope you have this already written down on your annotations for Invalid Story, we are concentrating again on dialogue and dialect. Now I want to point out for your notes at 2B, we have always two questions when we look at the rhetorical work of an author. Not what an author says, but how an author says it. It's the what is it and how does it work question again, just to remind. So yeah, we're going to find examples of dialogue and dialect in this text, but we're going to ask the more important question, how does it work? Like, how does it contribute to the overall theme, messages of the text itself, and that kind of thing, all right? Let's now turn to page 360. The guiding question, is conflict necessary? Will be a central part of this discussion, and we're going to focus on the conflict of this text, no question. The vocabulary is important. Again, you want to make sure you're paying attention to that. Let's meet Mark Twain on 361. Now, hey, put this in your notes. Two observations. One, Mark Twain is often considered America's greatest writer. So let's put that one down. Certainly, there's no question that maybe one of the greatest novels in American history, and maybe some argue one of the greatest novels ever written, is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is, of course, well known and as well should be read. But The Adventures of Huck Finn is considered one of the greatest novels ever written. Let's also say that in your junior year, you will meet Mark Twain officially, because he's one of the great writers of American literature. However, in your freshman year, you're going to have a text by Twain. In your sophomore anthology, you're going to have a text by Twain. We want you to at least have some working familiarity with this writer. For us, note the dates. 1835 to 1910. So that's significant in terms of just kind of when he lived into the beginning of the 20th century. Born Samuel Clemens. I'm reading with you on 361. Born Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain grew up in the Mississippi River town of Hannibal, Missouri. He worked as a riverboat pilot, printer, prospector, reporter, and many other jobs. Primarily, however, Clemens was a writer of comic stories, sketches, and novels. And I want to focus on the word comic, so write this down. Twain always defined himself as a comic, okay? He loved the idea that humans are clowns, okay? And of course, Shakespeare invented this idea that the world is like a stage and there are always going to be clowns to fill the stage. That human behavior can be comic, can be funny, okay? And so we're going to see that, in fact, even to some degree in this text. The most famous humorist of his day, he traveled the world entertaining people with his witty lectures. If you know anything about stand-up comedy, you know what I'm talking about, where a guy stands up or a girl stands up and starts telling jokes and everybody laughs. We haven't always had that notion. Twain was actually one of the first ones to travel America doing that very thing, okay? By the Mark Twain, quote-unquote, was a cry heard on the riverboats of Clemens' youth. It meant that the water was 2 fathoms deep, deep enough for a riverboat to pass unharmed. Harkening back to his youth working on those boats, Clemens took the name Mark Twain at age 27. So at age 27, he changes his name from Samuel Clemens to Mark Twain. Under that name, he wrote some of the most beloved fiction in American literature. And then did you know, Mark Twain was the first writer to turn himself into a business. He even trademarked his name. Now the background for this story is important on 361. Let's read it. 19th century train travel. In the late 19th century, when this story takes place, trains were the fastest way to travel and transport cargo. Nonetheless, train cars in which people with cargo had to travel were uncomfortable. The cars were poorly ventilated, boxes on wheels, and had only small windows. All right, so let's turn now to the Invalid Story. Here, jot down, we're going to look at two things in this story, as we are often want to do. So jot this down before we begin. Two questions, we might say. One, the first thing we want to pay attention to is the central conflict of this story. So write that down, right? Conflict, especially as it relates to issues of dialogue and dialect, no question. But what is the conflict or the struggle in this story? That's our first question. Number two, we're going to ask about irony. Irony, okay? That is to say, when something happens in the story that nobody expected, okay? It's a surprise of a kind. So I'm going to ask you at the end of the story, what is for you the surprise in this story or the irony in this story? All right, let's go ahead now. Follow along. Let's enjoy the reading. But again, don't just let the reader read it to you. You read along. You are preparing for the testing that's coming, guys, for you throughout the rest of your high school career that you're going to have to read. So challenge yourself, conquer monkey mind, and see if you can keep up with the reading. I hope this story entertains you as well.
The Invalid Story by Mark Twain. I seem 60 and married. But these effects are due to my condition and sufferings, for I am a bachelor and only 41. It will be hard for you to believe that I, who am now but a shadow, was a hale, hearty man 2 short years ago, a man of iron, a very athlete. Yet such is the simple truth. But stranger still than this fact is the way in which I lost my health. I lost it through helping to take care of a box of guns on a 200-mile railway journey one winter's night. It is the actual truth, and I will tell you about it. I belong in Cleveland, Ohio. One winter's night, 2 years ago, I reached home just after dark in a driving snowstorm, and the first thing I heard when I entered the house was that my dearest boyhood friend and schoolmate, John B. Hackett, had died the day before, and that his last utterance had been a desire that I would take his remains home to his poor old father and mother in Wisconsin. I was greatly shocked and grieved, but there was no time to waste in emotions. I must start at once. I took the card marked Deacon Levi Hackett, Bethlehem, Wisconsin, and hurried off through the whistling storm to the railway station. Arrived there, I found the long white pine box which had been described to me. I fastened the card to it with some tacks, saw it put safely aboard the express car, and then ran into the eating room to provide myself with a sandwich and some cigars. When I returned presently, there was my coffin box back again, apparently, and a young fellow examining around it with a card in his hands and some tacks and a hammer. I was astonished and puzzled. He began to nail on his card, and I rushed out to the express car in a good deal of a state of mind to ask for an explanation. But no, there was my box all right in the express car. It hadn't been disturbed. The fact is that, without my suspecting it, a prodigious mistake had been made. I was carrying off a box of guns, which that young fellow had come to the station to ship to a rifle company in Peoria, Illinois, and he had got my corpse. Just then, the conductor sang out, "All aboard!" and I jumped into the express car and got a comfortable seat on a bale of buckets. The expressman was there, hard at work, a plain man of 50, with a simple, honest, good-natured face, and a breezy, practical heartiness in his general style. As the train moved off, a stranger skipped into the car and set a package of peculiarly mature and capable Limburger cheese on one end of my coffin box. I mean my box of guns. That is to say, I know now that it was Limburger cheese. But at that time, I never had heard of the article in my life, and of course was wholly ignorant of its character. Well, we sped through the wild night. The bitter storm raged on. A cheerless misery stole over me. My heart went down, down, down. The old expressman made a brisk remark or two about the tempest and the Arctic weather, slammed his sliding doors to, and bolted them, closed his window down tight, and then went bustling around here and there and yonder, setting things to rights, and all the time contentedly humming "Sweet By and By" in a low tone, and flatting a good deal. Presently, I began to detect a most evil and searching odor stealing about on the frozen air. This depressed my spirits still more, because, of course, I attributed it to my poor departed friend. There was something infinitely saddening about his calling himself to my remembrance in this dumb, pathetic way, so it was hard to keep the tears back. Moreover, it distressed me on account of the old expressman, who I was afraid might notice it. However, he went humming tranquilly on and gave no sign, and for this I was grateful. Grateful, yes, but still uneasy. And soon I began to feel more and more uneasy every minute. For every minute that went by, that odor thickened up the more, and got to be more and more gamey and hard to stand. Presently, having got things arranged to his satisfaction, the expressman got some wood and made up a tremendous fire in his stove. This distressed me more than I can tell, for I could not but feel that it was a mistake. I was sure that the effect would be deleterious upon my poor departed friend. Thompson, the expressman's name was Thompson, as I found out in the course of the night, now went poking around his car, stopping up whatever stray cracks he could find, remarking that it didn't make any difference what kind of a night it was outside. He calculated to make us comfortable anyway. I said nothing, but I believed he was not choosing the right way. Meantime, he was humming to himself just as before. And meantime, too, the stove was getting hotter and hotter, and the place closer and closer. I felt myself growing pale and qualmish, but grieved in silence and said nothing. Soon I noticed that the sweet by and by was gradually fading out. Next, it ceased altogether, and there was an ominous stillness. After a few moments, Thompson said, "Phew, I reckon it ain't no sentiment I've loaded up this year stove with." He gasped once or twice, then moved toward the gun box, stood over that Limburger cheese part of a moment, then came back and sat down near me, looking a good deal impressed. After a contemplative pause, he said, indicating the box with a gesture, "Friend of yourn?" "Yes," I said with a sigh. "He's pretty ripe, ain't he?" Nothing further was said for perhaps a couple of minutes, each being busy with his own thoughts. Then Thompson said in a low, awed voice, "Sometimes it's uncertain whether they're really gone or not. Seem gone, you know. Body warm, joints limber. And so, although you think they're gone, you don't really know. I've had cases in my car. It's perfectly awful, because you don't know what minute they'll rise up and look at you." Then, after a pause, and slightly lifting his elbow toward the box, "But he ain't in no trance." "No, sir. I go bail for him." We sat some time in meditative silence, listening to the wind and the roar of the train. Then Thompson said, with a good deal of feeling, well, we've all got to go. They ain't no getting around it. Man that is born of woman is of few days and far between, as Scripture says. Yes, you look at it any way you want to. It's awful solemn and curious. They ain't nobody can get around it. All's got to go. Just everybody, as you may say. One day you're hearty and strong." Here he scrambled to his feet and broke a pane and stretched his nose out at it a moment or two, then sat down again, while I struggled up and thrust my nose out at the same place, and this we kept on doing every now and then. And next day he's cut down like the grass, and the places which knowed him then knows him no more forever, as Scripture says. Yes, indeedy, it's awful solemn and curious, but we've all got to go, one time or another. They ain't no getting around it. There was another long pause. Then, what did he die of? I said I didn't know. How long has he been dead? It seemed judicious to enlarge the facts to fit the probabilities. So I said, 2 or 3 days. But it did no good, for Thompson received it with an injured look, which plainly said, 2 or 3 years, you mean? Then he went right along, placidly ignoring my statement, and gave his views at considerable length upon the unwisdom of putting off burials too long. Then he lounged off toward the box, stood a moment, then came back on a sharp trot and visited the broken pane, observing, "'Twould have been a darn sight better all around if they'd started him along last summer." Thompson sat down and buried his face in his red silk handkerchief and began to slowly sway and rock his body like one who was doing his best to endure the almost unendurable. By this time, the fragrance, if you may call it fragrance, was just about suffocating, as near as you can come at it. Thompson's face was turning gray. I knew mine hadn't any color left in it. By and by, Thompson rested his forehead in his left hand, with his elbow on his knee, and sort of waved his red handkerchief toward the box with his other hand and said, "I've carried a many a one of 'em. Some of 'em considerable overdue, too. But Lordy, he just lays over 'em all and does it easy. Cap, they was heliotrope to him." This recognition of my poor friend gratified me, in spite of the sad circumstances, because it had so much the sound of a compliment. Pretty soon it was plain that something had got to be done. I suggested cigars. Thompson thought it was a good idea. He said, "Likely it'll modify him some." We puffed gingerly along for a while and tried hard to imagine that things were improved. But it wasn't any use. Before very long, and without any consultation, both cigars were quietly dropped from our nerveless fingers at the same moment. Thompson said with a sigh, "No, Cap, it don't modify him worth a cent. Fact is, it makes him worse, because it appears to stir up his ambition. What do you reckon we better do now?" I was not able to suggest anything. Indeed, I had to be swallowing and swallowing all the time, and did not like to trust myself to speak. Thompson fell to maundering in a desultory and low-spirited way about the miserable experiences of this night, and he got to referring to my poor friend by various titles, sometimes military ones, sometimes civil ones. And I noticed that as fast as my poor friend's effectiveness grew, Thompson promoted him accordingly, gave him a bigger title. Finally, he said, "I've got an idea. Supposing we buckle down to it and give the colonel a bit of a shove toward t'other end of the car, about 10 foot, say. It wouldn't have so much influence then, don't you reckon?" I said it was a good scheme. So we took in a good fresh breath at the broken pane, calculating to hold it till we got through. Then we went there and bent over that deadly cheese and took a grip on the box. Thompson nodded. "All ready." And then we threw ourselves forward with all our might. But Thompson slipped and slumped down with his nose on the cheese, and his breath got loose. He gagged and gasped, and floundering up and made a break for the door, pawing the air and saying hoarsely, "Don't hinder me! Give me the road! I'm a-dying! Give me the road!" Out on the cold platform, I sat down and held his head a while, and he revived. Presently he said, Do you reckon we started the General any? I said no. We hadn't budged him. Well then, that idea's up the flume. We got to think up something else. He's suited where he is, I reckon. And if that's the way he feels about it, and has made up his mind that he don't wish to be disturbed, you bet he's a-going to have his own way in the business. Yes, better leave him right where he is, long as he wants it so, because he holds all the trumps. Don't you know? And so it stands to reason that the man that lays out to alter his plans for him is going to get left. But we couldn't stay out there in that mad storm. We should have frozen to death. So we went in again and shut the door, and began to suffer once more and take turns at the break in the window. By and by, as we were starting away from a station where we had stopped a moment, Thompson pranced in cheerily and exclaimed, "We're all right now. I reckon we've got the Commodore this time. I judge I've got the stuff here that'll take the tuck out of him." It was carbolic acid. He had a carboy of it. He sprinkled it all around, everywhere. In fact, he drenched everything with it, rifle box, cheese, and all. Then we sat down, feeling pretty hopeful. But it wasn't for long. You see, the two perfumes began to mix, and then, well, pretty soon we made a break for the door. And out there, Thompson swabbed his face with his bandana and said in a kind of disheartened way, "It ain't no use. We can't buck again him. He just utilizes everything we put up to modify him with and gives it his own flavor and